Pope Leo XV walks into a quiet Swiss café. What the elderly baker reveals leaves him in total silence. The pontiff's steps echoed softly against the cobblestones of Grindelwald as the first light of dawn crept through the alpine mist. But his mind remained trapped in the suffocating conference rooms of the Vatican, where 3 weeks of crisis meetings had left him feeling more like a corporate executive than a shepherd of souls. He pulled his simple black coat tighter against the mountain chill, the weight of his papal ring hidden beneath worn leather gloves. For the first time in months, no Swiss guards flanked his movements. No photographers waited to capture his expression. No cardinals hovered with urgent briefings about the latest abuse allegations that had rocked dioceses across 3 continents. His personal secretary had arranged this unofficial retreat with characteristic discretion, a small monastery in the Swiss Alps where Pope Leo XIV could disappear for 48 hours without the world noticing his absence. The village of Grindelwald stirred gently around him as he walked its narrow streets. Church bells chimed 6 o'clock from the ancient parish tower, their bronze voices carrying across red-tiled roofs and flower boxes already blooming with early spring color. The air here tasted different than Vatican City, cleaner, thinner, untainted by the political machinations that had consumed his papacy for the past year. Every breath felt like a small absolution. An elderly woman in a dark shawl shuffled past, nodding respectfully without recognition. A baker wheeled fresh loaves on a wooden cart, steam rising from the bread like incense. These simple morning rituals, repeated for centuries in this pocket of the world, offered something the Vatican's grandeur never could: anonymity, normalcy, the blessed ordinariness of human life, continuing regardless of papal pronouncements or church scandals. Pope Leo XIV paused at a street corner, uncertain which direction to take. The monastery lay another half-hour's walk up the mountain path, but something about the village's peaceful rhythm made him reluctant to retreat into prayer and solitude just yet. After weeks of confronting the church's failures, he craved not divine guidance, but human connection, the kind that existed before he became the vicar of Christ, when he was simply Father Antonio tending to souls rather than managing an institution bleeding credibility. The scent of fresh bread and coffee drifted from somewhere nearby, promising warmth and perhaps a few moments more of being nobody special. Following the aroma of freshly baked bread, Pope Leo XIV discovered a café so small it seemed forgotten by time itself. Café Edelweiss, nestled between the village's stone church and its quiet cemetery, as if serving as a bridge between the world of the living and the eternal. The building's weathered wooden shutters and hand-painted sign suggested it had been here since the mountains first settled into their ancient positions. A brass bell chimed softly as he pushed open the heavy door, stepping into warmth that enveloped him like an embrace. The interior held perhaps 6 tables, each bearing the patina of countless conversations and shared meals. Copper pots gleamed from shelves that lined walls blackened by decades of wood smoke, and the scent of cinnamon and yeast created an atmosphere of profound comfort. Behind the counter, an elderly woman looked up from arranging pastries in a glass case. She was perhaps 80, with silver hair pinned back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of mountain lakes, clear, deep, and surprisingly alert. Her hands, though weathered by age, moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime creating sustenance for others. "Guten Morgen," she said warmly, her German accent softening the words. "You are early visitor to our village." Pope Leo XIV nodded, grateful for her switch to accented Italian. "Good morning. I was drawn by the wonderful smell of your baking." She studied his face with the unhurried attention of someone accustomed to reading people's stories in their expressions. Her gaze lingered on his clerical collar, barely visible beneath his coat, then traveled to his hands, his posture, the careful way he carried himself. "I am Margaret Zimmerman," she said, wiping flour-dusted fingers on her apron. "This cafe belongs to my family for 4 generations. You may sit anywhere you like. You're only customer this early." Pope Leo XIV chose a table near the window, where morning light filtered through lace curtains onto worn wooden surfaces. The view overlooked the cemetery's ancient headstones, some so weathered their inscriptions had surrendered to time. Margaret approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate containing a single pastry, golden and fragrant. "On the house," she said simply. "You have the look of someone carrying heavy thoughts." Their eyes met, and Pope Leo XIV felt that peculiar sensation of being seen, not as a pontiff or even as a priest, but as a man in need of kindness. The pastry melted on Pope Leo XIV's tongue, layers of buttery dough and sweet apple filling that spoke of recipes passed down through generations. He savored both the taste and the blessed silence, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunbeams, while Margaret moved quietly behind her counter, the soft sounds of preparation creating a gentle rhythm. The bell chimed again as 3 elderly men entered, stamping snow from their boots and greeting Margaret in rapid Swiss German. They settled at a corner table with the ease of long-time habit, their voices a comfortable murmur that added to the cafe's intimate atmosphere. One glanced toward Pope Leo XIV with polite curiosity before returning to his companions. Margaret approached with fresh coffee, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. As she refilled his cup, she spoke quietly in Italian. "You know I have seen your face before." Pope Leo XIV's hand stilled on his cup. "Perhaps we've met in Rome?" "No," she said, settling into the chair across from him with surprising directness. "On television, during the Easter Mass last year." Her lake-blue eyes held his steadily. "You are Pope Leo XIV." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Pope Leo XIV felt his carefully constructed anonymity crumble. Yet something in Margaret's tone, respectful but not reverent, knowing but not intrusive, kept him from the instinctive retreat his position usually demanded. "I had hoped to be simply another traveller this morning," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, understanding flickering across her weathered features. "And so you are. A traveller who happens to be Pope, not a Pope who happens to be travelling." She gestured toward the 3 men, who remained absorbed in their own conversation. They see only a priest taking coffee. Sometimes the eyes see what the heart expects. "And what does your heart expect, Frau Zimmermann?" She smiled, the expression transforming her face into something both maternal and wise. "I expect that even the Holy Father needs a place to rest without ceremony. My café has sheltered many travelers over the years, some fleeing persecution, some fleeing themselves, some simply fleeing." Her voice carried the weight of long experience. "The walls here know how to keep secrets." Pope Leo XIV studied her face, noting the lines etched by decades of welcoming strangers, the hands that had offered comfort through countless small acts of hospitality. In her presence, he felt an unexpected easing of the tension that had gripped his shoulders for weeks. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "I might simply be Antonio this morning." "Welcome, Antonio," Margaret replied, her eyes twinkling with gentle conspiracy. "Would you like to see how we make our bread?" The kitchen of Café Edelweiss existed in a different century. Thick wooden beams crossed a low ceiling blackened by decades of wood smoke, while copper pots hung from iron hooks like silent sentinels. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, its fire crackling softly beneath a kettle that seemed permanently at simmer. Pope Leo XIV felt transported to a world where time moved differently, measured not in Vatican schedules, but in the rhythm of rising dough. Margaret stood at a flour-dusted table, her hands working a mound of pale dough with movements that spoke, Of 6 decades of practice, she pushed, folded, turned, each motion economical yet graceful, like a prayer made manifest through labor. "This recipe came from my grandmother," she said, not looking up from her work. "She taught me when I was 12 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the table." Pope Leo XIII watched, mesmerized by the simple beauty of creation through human hands. In the Vatican, he was surrounded by masterpieces, but this humble act of bread-making held its own profound artistry. "You've been baking here for 60 years?" he asked. Margaret's hands paused for just a moment. "Since I was 20, my husband's family owned this cafe." Her voice carried a note of carefully guarded memory. "I was city girl from Zurich. Thought village life would be simple, peaceful." "And was it?" She resumed kneading, her movements now more deliberate. "Peace is not always what it appears to be, Antonio. Sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest secrets." Pope Leo XIV felt the weight behind her words, the suggestion of stories carefully buried beneath decades of daily routine. He wanted to ask more, but something in her posture warned against pressing too quickly. "The war years must have been difficult," he ventured gently. Margaret's hands stilled entirely. She looked up, studying his face with those penetrating lake blue eyes. "You ask questions like a priest," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "always looking for the pain beneath the surface." "Occupational hazard," he replied softly. She shaped the dough into a round loaf with practiced efficiency, then placed it in a banneton basket lined with cloth. "Some stories, they need the right moment to be told, the right listener." Her gaze met his again. "Perhaps we are not quite there yet." The kitchen fell silent except for the fire's gentle crackling and the distant murmur of the 3 regulars in the dining room. Pope Leo XIV sensed layers of history in this humble space, tragedies and triumphs kneaded into the very walls like ingredients in bread. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the cafe's worn wooden floors. The 3 regular customers had departed, leaving Pope Leo XIV and Margaret alone with the weight of unspoken history. She had closed the cafe for the day, turning the sign and drawing the curtains with movements that suggested ritual rather than routine. Then sat at the same table where morning had found them, but the atmosphere had transformed. The playful conspiracy of his anonymity had given way to something deeper, more solemn. Margaret's hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long grown cold, her eyes focused on memories only she could see. "In 1943, she began quietly, "this village was different. Switzerland was neutral, yes, but neutrality does not mean safe, especially not for those running from the Nazis." Pope Leo XIV leaned forward slightly, sensing the gravity of what she was about to share. "My husband Franz's father, he was, practical man, but also good man." Her voice carried the cadence of someone choosing each word carefully. "When first refugees came through mountain passes, starving, terrified, he could not turn them away." She gestured toward the kitchen door. "We had more space then. Dining room was twice this size. We would serve them food, let them rest. Just for one night, we told ourselves. Just until they could continue to France." "But it became more than one night," Pope Leo XIV said gently. Margaret nodded, her lake blue eyes growing distant. "Word spreads, even in mountains. Soon we had families arriving every week. Jewish families mostly, but also political prisoners, resistance fighters, even German deserters." She paused, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the table. "We became what you might call way station." The magnitude of what she was describing settled over Pope Leo XIV like a weight. This humble cafe, with its cheerful copper pots and flower print curtains, had been a lifeline for desperate souls fleeing genocide. "The risk must have been enormous," he said, Swiss authorities, they looked other way mostly. But German patrols, they came sometimes to border villages, searched houses, asked questions. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. We learned to hide people quickly, quietly, to make this place look like simple mountain cafe, nothing more. She rose suddenly and walked to a particular section of the wall, running her hand along what appeared to be decorative paneling. 78 people passed through here during war, 78 souls we helped save. Her fingers found something, and Pope Leo XIV heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. Would you like to see where? We kept them safe. Margaret retrieved a flashlight from behind the counter, its beam cutting through the darkness beyond the hidden door. Pope Leo XIV followed her down narrow stone steps that had been worn smooth by centuries of feet. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the earthy scent of ancient stone and preserved wood. The cellar opened into a space larger than he had expected, carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding preserves and wine bottles, but Margaret led him past these ordinary provisions to the far corner where shadows seemed deeper, more purposeful. Here, she said, directing the flashlight toward what appeared to be another wall of shelving. But as Pope Leo XIV looked closer, he noticed the gaps between the stones, the way the shelves could slide aside. When German patrols came, families would hide here, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. She moved the shelving with surprising ease, revealing a space behind it barely large enough for several people to crouch. The walls bore the scratches of human presence, names carved in multiple languages, dates, even small drawings that spoke of children trying to make sense of incomprehensible terror. Pope Leo XIV knelt before the opening, running his fingers over the carved words. Sarah, age 7, Jakob and Ruth Stern, 1943. Danke, Familie Zimmermann. Each inscription was a life saved, a family preserved, a testimony to the power of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage. My husband's father, he dug this space himself, Margaret said, her voice echoing softly in the stone chamber. Worked at night for months, carrying out rocks in potato sacks. His wife would tell neighbors he was improving wine storage. The beam of her flashlight illuminated more scratches, more names, a Star of David carved deep into the stone. Pope Leo XIV felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, not the sanitized history of textbooks, but the raw, desperate reality of human beings fighting for survival. The children were hardest, Margaret continued quietly. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that they must be silent for hours, that their life depends on making no sound? Pope Leo XIV remained kneeling, overwhelmed by the sacred nature of this hidden space. Here was a different kind of sanctuary than any cathedral, holiness born not from ritual and doctrine, but from the most fundamental human choice between good and evil. Margaret, he said softly, this is hallowed ground. She nodded, then switched off the flashlight, leaving them in complete darkness for a moment. Some of the children who hid here, they wrote letters to their parents after war, letters I still keep upstairs. When she restored the light, her eyes held a weight that spoke of stories yet untold. They climbed back into the cafe's main room as evening shadows crept across the mountains outside. The sacred weight of the cellar still clung to Pope Leo XIV's shoulders as he settled back into his chair, but something had shifted in Margaret's demeanor. Her movements carried a new tension, as if the descent into memory had unlocked doors she'd preferred to keep closed. She prepared fresh coffee with mechanical precision, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged cups on a tray. When she finally sat across from him again, her lake-blue eyes held a darkness that hadn't been there before. You asked earlier about the war years, she said quietly, staring at her hands, about whether they were difficult. Pope Leo XIV waited, sensing that whatever came next would cut deeper than the heroic tale of hidden refugees. Our village priest. During those years was Father Müller, Margaret continued, her voice carefully controlled. Young man, maybe 35, came here from Munich just before war started. She paused, seeming to weigh her words. At first he seemed good priest. Gave beautiful sermons about love, compassion, Christ's mercy. The way she spoke the word seemed made Pope Leo XIV's chest tighten with foreboding. When first refugees began arriving, some villagers went to him, asked what Christ would want them to do, how they should respond to these desperate families. Margaret's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. Father Müller told them that God's will was mysterious, that perhaps these people's suffering was divine punishment, that good Catholics should not interfere with God's plan. The words hit Pope Leo XIV like physical blows. He had read reports of clerical collaboration during the war, had attended countless meetings about the Church's complicated wartime legacy, but hearing it from this woman, whose family had risked everything to save lives, made the institutional failure devastatingly personal. But that wasn't the worst of it, Margaret continued, her voice growing smaller. When German patrols started coming through village, asking questions, Father Müller, he told them which families might be helping. Refugees, said it was his duty to prevent lawlessness in his parish. Pope Leo XIV felt the familiar weight that had plagued him through weeks of abuse crisis meetings, the crushing realization of how those entrusted with Christ's message could become instruments of betrayal instead of healing. 3 families were arrested because of his information, Margaret whispered, taken to labor camps. Only one father ever came home. The café fell silent, except for the wind beginning to whistle through the mountains outside, carrying with it the ghosts of choices made and unmade. The narrow staircase behind the kitchen led to Margaret's apartment, a modest space under the eaves where slanted ceilings created intimate corners filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Pope Leo XIII followed her into a sitting room dominated by an old ceramic stove, its warmth radiating through the small space like an embrace. Photographs covered every surface. Wedding pictures, village festivals, grandchildren's school portraits. But Margaret moved past them all to a simple wooden desk by the window. She opened the top drawer with reverent care and withdrew a small framed photograph, handling it as if it were made of spun glass. "This is Klaus," she said softly, settling into a worn armchair and motioning for Pope Leo XIV to take the seat beside her. He was 11 when his family arrived here in November 1943. Pope Leo XIV studied the photograph. A thin boy with enormous, dark eyes stared back at him, wearing clothes too large for his frame, and an expression far too old for his years. But there was something else in that young face, a fierce intelligence, a stubborn spark of hope that persecution hadn't yet extinguished. His parents, Samuel and Rachel Bergman, they had walked for 2 weeks through mountain passes. Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tender tone of someone recounting a beloved child's story. Klaus had frostbite on his feet, couldn't walk properly. His mother carried him the last 3 days. She touched the photograph gently, as if she could still feel the weight of that frightened boy in her arms. They stayed in Celle for 5 days while we arranged passage to France. But French border, it became impossible. Too many patrols, too dangerous. Her voice caught slightly. Samuel made a decision that broke his heart, asked us to keep Klaus. While they tried to reach relatives in Geneva, said they would come back for him when it was safe. Pope Leo XIV felt his throat tighten as he began to understand the trajectory of this story. "They never made it," Margaret whispered. "Caught at border crossing 3 days later, sent to Auschwitz on transport train." She looked up, meeting his eyes with a grief that 60 years hadn't dimmed. Klaus waited for them every day for 6 months, would sit at this window watching road, certain they would return. The photograph trembled in her weathered hands. "I promised him they would come back. Promised him every night when he cried himself to sleep. What else could I say to an 11-year-old boy whose world had disappeared?" Outside the window, darkness was settling over the village. But inside this small room, the weight of a child's broken trust filled every corner. Margaret rose with the careful movements of someone carrying invisible weight and led Pope Leo XIV into her bedroom, a space so small it seemed designed for solitude and reflection. An old wooden trunk sat at the foot of her narrow bed, its brass corners dulled by decades, but still bearing the craftsmanship of another era. She knelt beside the trunk with ceremony, lifting the heavy lid to reveal layers of carefully preserved memories, christening gowns, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, documents wrapped in tissue paper. But she moved past these family treasures to a separate compartment, from which she withdrew a bundle of letters bound with blue string. "After the war ended, Klaus learned to write properly," she said, settling on the bed beside the open trunk. "He was a brilliant boy, spoke German, French, Italian, even some English, thought if he could write well enough, write to important people, someone would help him find his parents." She untied the blue string with trembling fingers, revealing a dozen letters written in careful, childish script. Pope Leo XIV could see the progression of Klaus's handwriting as he grew older, the desperate precision of a boy who believed perfect penmanship might save his family. He wrote to Red Cross, to Swiss government, to refugee organizations, Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But most of all, he wrote to Vatican, to Pope Pius X himself. She handed Pope Leo XIV the first letter, dated June 1946. The paper was cream-colored, the writing meticulous, each letter formed with the concentration of someone for whom words represented hope itself. "Your Holiness," the letter began, "my name is Klaus Bergmann, and I am 13 years old. My parents were taken by the Nazis, and I am looking for them. I live with kind family in Switzerland, but I need the Church's help to find my mother and... Father, please help me. I pray to God every day, and I know he hears me through you." Pope Leo XIV felt his hands shake as he read. The boy's faith poured from every carefully constructed sentence, his absolute trust that the Vicar of Christ would move heaven and earth to reunite a child with his family. "There are 11 more letters," Margaret said quietly. Each one more desperate than the last, each one begging for just one response, one sign that someone in Vatican cared about Klaus Bergmann. She reached for another letter, dated 2 years later, the handwriting now showing the frustration of adolescence. "Did any of them receive responses?" Pope Leo XIV asked, though he already knew the answer from the devastation in her eyes. "Not one," Margaret whispered. 60 years and not one word." They returned to the cafe kitchen in silence, the weight of Klaus's unanswered letters hanging between them like an accusation. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward Pope Leo XIV with grasping of fingers. He sat heavily at the small wooden table where Margaret had kneaded bread that morning, a lifetime ago it seemed now. Margaret moved about the kitchen with mechanical precision, preparing tea neither of them wanted. Her hands shook as she filled the kettle, the simple task becoming an anchor against the storm of memory she had unleashed. "He stopped writing to the Vatican when he turned 18, she said finally, her back still turned to him. By then, he had learned the truth about the camps, about what happened to his parents. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind countless times. The hope died hard, but it died. Pope Leo XIV stared at his hands. Soft hands that had never known real labor, never carried a child to safety, never written desperate letters that would disappear into institutional silence. What became of him? Margaret turned, her lake blue eyes now reflecting something that might have been pity. He stayed with us until he was 21. We offered to adopt him legally, but he said he belonged to no one anymore. Got scholarship to university in Geneva. Brilliant, as I told you. Studied engineering. She set the tea service on the table, with excessive care, as if the ritual could somehow contain the devastation of what she was about to reveal. He never married, never came back to church after his 18th birthday, said if God existed, he had chosen to be silent when a child begged for help. Her hands wrapped around her teacup, but she didn't drink. He wrote me letters for 40 years, always kind, always grateful, but never believing in anything beyond what he could see and touch. The parallel to his current crisis crashed over Pope Leo XIV with sickening clarity. Another institution, another set of victims writing desperate letters, another bureaucracy too vast and self-important to respond to individual suffering. How many Klaus Bergmans had written to the Vatican in recent years, begging for acknowledgement, for justice, for simple human recognition of their pain? When did he die? Pope Leo XIV asked quietly. 3 years ago. Heart attack in his apartment in Geneva. Alone. Margaret finally met his eyes. I was the only one at his funeral. He had no faith to comfort him, no community to mourn him. Just an old woman who remembered the boy who waited by the window. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the settling of embers in the hearth, the sound of things burning down to ash. The clock on the cafe wall chimed midnight, its bronze notes echoing through the empty dining room like a funeral bell. Pope Leo XIV sat motionless at the same table where he had first tasted Margaret's pastry 12 hours ago, but he felt like a different man entirely, hollowed out, stripped of the certainties that had sustained him through a lifetime of faith and service. I have to do something, he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. There must be some way to honor his memory, to acknowledge what the church failed to do. Margaret watched him from across the table, her weathered face etched with something that might have been compassion or pity. What would you do, Antonio? Build monument? Send official apology to empty grave? The questions cut through him like blades. In the Vatican, he wielded power that could shape global policy, influence world leaders, command the attention of millions. But what good was papal authority against the irreversible damage of institutional indifference? I could establish a foundation, he said desperately, for Holocaust survivors, for refugee children. Klaus's name could... Klaus wanted one thing, Margaret interrupted gently, just one response to his letters, one sign that the church saw him as human being worth acknowledging. Her voice carried no accusation, which somehow made it worse. All the foundations in world cannot give 11-year-old boy what he needed when he needed it. Pope Leo XIV buried his face in his hands, feeling the weight of every crisis meeting, every institutional response, every carefully crafted statement that had prioritized the Church's reputation over individual suffering. How many letters had crossed papal desks over the decades? How many cries for help had been filtered through layers of bureaucracy until they became mere statistics? I am sorry, he whispered, the words inadequate, but all he had. I am so deeply sorry for what my church failed to do. Margaret reached across the table and touched his wrist with fingers worn smooth by decades of service. Your sorrow is real, I can see that. But Klaus cannot hear apologies anymore. She paused, studying his face in the dim light. Question is not whether church can undo past. Question is whether it will choose differently next time. Outside, the Swiss wind whistled through the village streets, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of morning still hours away. Inside the cafe, two people sat in the ruins of faith examined too closely, surrounded by the ghosts of choices that could never be unmade. Can you forgive us? Pope Leo XIV asked quietly. Margaret's silence stretched between them like a chasm, and he realized that some questions had no answers. Only the terrible honesty of wounds that time could soften but never fully heal. Dawn crept through the mountains with reluctant grace, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that had witnessed countless mornings like this one. Pope Leo XV stood at the café window, watching the village of Grindelwald stir to life. A baker wheeling his cart down cobblestone streets, children emerging with school bags, the eternal rhythm of human existence continuing despite the weight of revelations that had shattered his night. He had not slept. Neither had Margaret, who moved through her morning preparations with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to carry grief as a constant companion. The aroma of fresh bread filled the café, the same scent that had drawn him here 24 hours ago, when he was still a different man, one who believed in the fundamental goodness of institutional authority. The bell chimed as the café door opened, admitting a young priest with kind eyes and nervous energy. Father Thomas Müller, no relation to the wartime collaborator, Margaret had quietly explained, served as the village pastor and had been summoned by an urgent early morning call. "Your Holiness," Father Müller said, clearly struggling with the surreal nature of finding the Pope in his small parish café. "Frau Zimmermann said you wished to speak with me." Pope Leo XIV turned from the window, his papal bearing tempered by something new, a humility born not from protocol, but from genuine brokenness. "Father Thomas, I need your help with something that extends far beyond this village." As they sat at the same table where truth had been unveiled, Pope Leo XIV outlined his vision. Not grand gestures or ceremonial foundations, but structural changes that would ensure letters like Klaus's could never disappear into bureaucratic silence again. A direct response protocol for every communication to the Vatican from victims, survivors, the forgotten. Mandatory acknowledgement within 30 days, personal oversight by the Pope himself for cases involving children. But that would require massive reorganization, Father Müller said, his administrative mind grappling with the implications. The Vatican receives thousands of letters. "Then we hire the staff to answer them," Pope Leo XIV replied firmly. "We create the systems to ensure every voice is heard." Klaus Bergmann wrote 11 letters to the Church over 4 years, 11 attempts to reach out to his spiritual father. If we cannot respond to a child's pain, what exactly are we shepherding? Margaret had been listening from behind the counter, occasionally refilling their coffee cups. Now she approached with something wrapped in brown paper, one of Klaus's letters, the first one, with its heartbreaking faith and careful penmanship. "Take this with you," she said to Pope Leo XIII. "When Vatican bureaucrats tell you such changes are impossible, read Klaus's words again. Remember that faith of 13-year-old boy who believed Pope would answer him." Pope Leo XIV accepted the letter with reverent care. What about here? What about honoring Klaus's memory in this place where he found the only family he ever knew? After the war, Margaret glanced around her café, at the copper pots that had witnessed decades of quiet ministry, at the hidden door that had preserved 78 lives, at the windows where a boy had waited for parents who would never return. "This place will remember," she said simply, "but not as museum or monument, as working café that still welcomes strangers, still offers warmth to those who need shelter." She paused, meeting his eyes. Klaus would not want his pain to become display. He would want it to become prevention. Father Müller leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. A partnership, perhaps, between the local parish and the Vatican's new response protocols? This café could serve as training ground for priests learning to minister to trauma survivors. Pope Leo XIV felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, for Klaus's wound would always remain, but purpose crystallizing from the ashes of institutional failure. When he walked into this cafe yesterday morning, he had been seeking escape from his responsibilities. Now he understood that true leadership meant running toward the pain, not away from it. As the three of them sat planning concrete changes that would honor one forgotten boy's letters, the morning light grew stronger, and Pope Leo XIV realized that Klaus Bergman would finally receive his answer, not the comfort he had needed as a child, but the promise that other children would never wait in silence again. When Pope Leo XIV visited a quiet Swiss café, what the elderly baker revealed left him in total silence, but from that silence a new kind of listening was born.